Anyone here seen Frank Auerbach? He's the man responsible for these extraordinary pictures. The seer of Camden, North London, where he's lived and painted virtually non-stop since the mid-50s, Auerbach hasn't done a television interview for more than a decade. Well, they get in the way of the painting, don't they? Just to synchronise the two cameras.
You go out and the number of eccentrics and the amount of life in the streets and the higgledy-piggledy architecture, and it just seems so full of vivacity and life that I found myself becoming very, very attached to it. I think all affections are to do with working together, even, it's probably indelicate, but even a physical relationship is working together, really. And I've worked with London. I've drawn London, and I've gone back to draw it again and again and used it for my paintings, and I've become fonder and fonder of it.
Some critics think these early works from the 50s bear the shadow of the war. Auerbach left his native Berlin as a 7-year-old as part of the Kindertransport. His parents died in Auschwitz. Bombed out London was shocking, but also stimulating to the fledgling artist.
Any artist would have found it immensely exciting because it looked like a great mountainous landscape and looked so fantastically dramatic. Great deep holes where they were making new buildings, sides of buildings sheared off, and I mean the touching thing of sometimes you saw pictures on the walls in the fireplace, somebody's life, and it had been sheared off. A lot of empty sites, and of course it had connotations, because I was here from school holidays sometimes during the war, and one would get up in the morning and you walked along the street and you looked to see which buildings had gone. And all that, of course, gets into one's bloodstream. When I started, the paintings became very, very thick, but it wasn't a question of sloshing on a huge amount of paint. But I was, I suppose, like every painter who's painting seriously, I was trying to make something new. And I had no idea of how to do it, and I didn't have the courage to scrape off what I'd done. So I painted and went on painting, and the painting changed, and I would take off a bit, and the painting the paintings for the first 15 or 20 years became extraordinarily thick. In fact, what you're making is, on a rectangular surface, a sort of design that works in space that is supposed to look like somebody. As soon as you start thinking about it like that, it begins to seem almost impossible. And so one goes on and struggles until one reaches the point, hopefully, where the thing seems to stand up for itself and you can't do anything with it. It looks like somebody else's painting.
Auerbach's been painting his small group of regular sitters for decades. Some 60 years in the case of Julia, Mrs. Auerbach. I think your wife said at one point that she found it a bit like doing the dishes.
Yes, she tries to take the mystique out of it. No, I wasn't in the least insulted, and that's very like Julia. I think she wanted to take if anybody had suggested that there was some sort of mystical element, one's wives are determined to puncture that balloon.
1962, Soho. Lucian Freud, Francis Bacon and Frank Auerbach. The three artists were friends, and Freud collected Auerbach's work. The more self-effacing musketeer has outlived the others and is emerging from their shadow. A good Auerbach could cost you north of £2 million.
Lucian and Francis, one of the things I admired them for, lived totally recklessly. Both, I think, with a totally justified conviction that they were talented enough to come through at the end. My life was adventurous enough for me. I was never, because I had absolutely no money, I was never physically adventurous. I remember he was gambling, and he took me along to the Playboy Club, where I would never have been in my life. And Lucian, who didn't seem to know the price of a packet of cigarettes, suddenly became immensely mathematically competent and played 3 games of Shemmy at the same time. And at one point, he'd won £1,600, huge amount of money in those days. And I thought, well, I'd save him from losing it again. And I said, look, I think I want to go home. So he kindly gave me a lift back home. And I saw him a couple of days later and said, you know, what happened? He said, well, actually, I went back and lost it all. And been to nightclubs thanks to Lucien, and I've been to fancy restaurants thanks to Francis. And, yes.
At 84, Auerbach still works all the time. He's given up his annual 1 day's holiday. How much of this is to do with giving a good account of a life he almost didn't have?
I think it may be that people develop the sense that finally, between the cradle and the grave, one's finally, I suppose, everybody alone. And I must perhaps, but you're making me say these things which I've never thought of, but perhaps I became aware of that very early, so I would try, so I think. And also I was aware of the fact that life was short and dangerous. I mean, anybody who'd been in the war would feel that, and that any of us could go any time, and that there was something pathetic about having an interesting and exciting life and there being no trace of it. And the only trace that I can think of is art.